Let's be real for a second. Have you ever felt completely played? I mean, you're chasing the American dream, the house, the job, the 401k, but then one day you wake up and realize that the entire map you've been following was drawn by someone else. That life you think you want, that vision of success that feels so right. Therefore, we need to talk about who actually wrote that script and how they slipped it to us. We're not talking fringe theories here. We're talking about the master blueprint that runs this entire country. To figure out how deep this goes, we start with basic truth. Humans cannot exist alone. We are biologically hardwired to need a tribe to teach us, protect us, and keep us alive. And the operating system for that tribe is called culture. Culture isn't just jazz and gallery art. It's the invisible script that tells you how to act, what to value, and how to make sense of the world. It makes life predictable. Without this shared blueprint, we'd lose our moral compass and our ability to organize. We'd just be lost. Therefore, culture is the most powerful tool for human survival. And whoever controls a culture controls a society. For the last 100 years in America, one institution has held an almost complete monopoly on crafting our national culture. Hollywood. It doesn't just entertain us, it teaches us what to want, who to love, and how to live. Therefore, we can measure its influence by tracking how it has hijacked the 5 foundational pillars that have held up every society in history. The family and the tribe, kinship and lineage, the law and the chief, order, hierarchy, and justice, the deal and the gift, reciprocity and cooperation, the code and the conscience, a moral framework of right and wrong, the spirit and the story, meaning and understanding the unknown. In this episode, we're going to place each American generation under the microscope. We'll analyze the movies they watched and the dreams they were sold. We will deconstruct the blueprint. The silent generation. Let's look at the silent generation. They were the first to get the treatment. They lived through the Great Depression and then won the war. Therefore, what they wanted most was stability, conformity, and peace. They valued their institutions, and they lived by the idea of the traditional home. For them, the family was an unbroken fortress, right? Pillar 1, that bedrock of kinship, had clear, unyielding roles. Dad was the ultimate authority, the provider. Mom was the anchor, the nurturer. This generation bought the ticket for that perfect suburban life Hollywood was selling them. But then Hollywood was the one getting ready to tear it down. They didn't need a bomb to destroy the family. They just needed a subtle shift in gravity. They started with Dad. Before the 1950s, the father figure, from Abraham Lincoln to the Western hero, was serious, decisive, and competent. But then, as the silent generation settled into their suburban tract homes, Hollywood began a slow, systemic character assassination. He was still called Father Knows Best, but then best increasingly meant bumbling. He was a good man, sure, but he was also slow, easily manipulated by his wife's feminine wiles, and completely lost outside the bounds of his office job. Therefore, Hollywood successfully introduced the Baffled Patriarch. By making the father a harmless, comedic figure, the script was quietly teaching the first lesson to the coming generation. Pillar 1 center of authority is weak. He can be safely ignored. The wife, however, remained competent, but then she was now performing a dual role, managing the house and managing the overgrown child she was married to. The blueprint was not for freedom, but for a new kind of quiet, domestic frustration. The seeds of the anti-authoritarian movement weren't planted in the universities. They were planted in the living rooms of suburban America, right in front of the flickering screen. The next step in the re-engineering was to tackle Pillar 2, the law and the chief. The silent generation's culture inherited a profound respect for institutions. The chief, the judge, the senator, the men who kept the chaotic world in order. But then Hollywood had just used the war to cement the chief's virtue, and now they had to break it. They did this by elevating the anti-hero. The protagonist was no longer the brave, clean-cut sheriff. He was the weary, rule-breaking private eye. He knew the system was rigged. Therefore, the only way to find justice wasn't through the law, but around it. The The script for the silent generation was being rewritten with a caveat. Pillar 2, the law and the chief, is necessary, but then it is not trustworthy. The only clean conscience is the rogue individual who operates outside the corrupt institution. Therefore, this taught the generation watching two corrosive ideas: that the people in charge are fundamentally compromised, and that the heroic path is one of loneliness and defiance. By the end of the 1950s, the foundations were laid. They had weakened the family father and introduced deep suspicion toward the civic chief. They weren't fighting the system yet, but they had been programmed to distrust it. The stage was set for the total cultural revolution that would sweep over their children, the baby boomers. They were the children of stability, raised in the fallout of the baffled patriarch and the cynical chief. They inherited unprecedented prosperity from their parents, but then they were sold on a new script: tear it all down. The silent generation's weakness became their children's weapon. They were primed to see all authority as illegitimate and all conformity as oppression. Therefore, this cultural revolution was the intended consequence of the previous decade of programming. The boomers were the first generation for whom Hollywood attacked the core operating system of morality. Pillar 4, the code and the conscience. For centuries, the West had been built on the code, the shared, external framework of right and wrong, usually religious. Hollywood's goal was to dissolve the code. Therefore, they replaced it with the conscience, the subjective, personal feeling of the individual. The moral compass was no longer held by the church, the law, or the father, but then it was held by the hero who broke those rules. The script introduced the virtuous villain. The system, the rules, was the antagonist, while the person who defied it was morally pure. By validating every personal transgression as an act of authenticity, Hollywood successfully divorced morality from social utility. Therefore, Pillar 4 was rewritten. The good life wasn't about being good for society. It was about being true to yourself. As the external moral code collapsed, so too did the external source of meaning. Pillar 5, the spirit and the story. If the chief was corrupt and the code was a lie, therefore the ultimate stories we told ourselves, our national myths, our religious narratives, must also be a conspiracy. Hollywood introduced the cynical mythmaker. Every traditional story was deconstructed and revealed to be a tool of control. The universe wasn't benevolent. It was absurd. The government wasn't protecting you, but then it was hiding the truth. The new story was one of paranoia. Meaning was not given by the spirit, but had to be discovered by the lone individual in a hostile, deceptive world. Therefore, the result was a generation hyper-focused on self-actualization, replacing the traditional pursuit of shared meaning. The father was a fool, the chief was a crook, the code was an oppression, and the story was a lie. The boomers, the new ruling class, had been programmed to distrust every foundational element of civilization. Generation X. They watched the boomers dismantle the world. Then they watched them get divorced. Therefore, the result was a generation programmed with two primary defense mechanisms: cynicism and apathy. The target for Gen X was Pillar 3, the deal and the gift. Hollywood taught the boomers to ignore the gift, but then for Gen X, they successfully erased the concept entirely, replacing it with a total transaction. The script for Gen X was radical economic individualism. The only relationship that mattered was the one that delivered maximum personal utility. Love was a negotiation. Therefore, everything was a commodity, and the only sin was being a sucker. Hollywood created the marketized hero. Your identity wasn't inherent. It was a brand be developed, marketed, and sold. But then, even rebellion was monetized and sold back to them as grunge or counterculture chic. Pillar 3, the deal and the gift, was twisted into a mantra. Every interaction is an exchange of value. If you don't get a return, you were exploited. Therefore, the sense of shared civic duty and the unconditional gift of community was deemed naive. This transactional mindset, combined with the boomers' shattered morality, delivered the perfect foot soldiers for the next ultimate phase of the blueprint. They had broken the family, corrupted the authorities, dissolved morality, and monetized the self. All that was needed was the catalyst. The millennials. They were born into the digital garden that Hollywood had prepared. They didn't just consume the script, but then they became the first generation to be given the tools to co-author it. By this stage, the traditional pillars were not just weakened, they were rendered obsolete by the new digital tribe. The social engineer was no longer a studio executive. It was a piece of code. The digital script redefined the tribe. Kinship was replaced by affinity. You no longer belonged to the group you were born into. Therefore, your true tribe was a global collective of people who liked the same content. This isolated the individual, even while making them feel perpetually connected. The chief was replaced by the crowd. The code was replaced by the feed. Justice was no longer a formal process, but then it was a matter of outrage, virality, and collective shaming, the ultimate manifestation of the individual conscience weaponized by the instantaneous mob. Pillar 3, reciprocity, became performance for payment. The ultimate story, Pillar 5, the spirit in the story, was no longer a search for universal meaning. Therefore, it was a construction and maintenance of the perfect, performative self-narrative. The only unforgivable sin was to be unmarketable. The ultimate success of the social engineering blueprint was not just in rewriting the pillars, but then in collapsing them into a single, self-referential digital loop. The millennial script was one of permanent crisis and performative selfhood. Then came Generation Z, the true postmodern citizens. They are the first cohort born entirely inside the collapsed blueprint. Their script is no longer about rebellion or self-discovery, but then it is about retribalization on digital terms. They rejected the millennial performance of the self. Therefore, they returned to the need for the tribe, Pillar 1, but one mediated entirely by the algorithm. The new blueprint is built on hyperidentity, since the law, the code, and the family have all been invalidated. Therefore, the only remaining source of meaning and order is a collective identity, the specialized, curated tribe. Loyalty is absolute, and deviation from the group's narrative is a betrayal of the new code, the individual conscience. Pillar 4 is now completely outsourced to the group consensus. The group feels a morality, but then the individual must comply. The social engineers of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the media succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They didn't just rewrite the script. They created a self-policing, hyper-polarized society. They have returned to the power of the tribe. But then this new tribe is algorithmically managed and constantly at war with every other tribe. This is the blueprint. The question is no longer who wrote the script. The question is, do you have the courage to walk off the set